Your city station presents Mrs. John W. Castle's Jr. in a Civilian Defense Volunteer Office program, News and Letters from Home and Abroad. Mrs. Castles.
Good morning, radio friends. The last week's events in this country have been so tremendous, so root-shaking, that we have been stunned, and in a sense, I think still we are suffering from shock. But time marches on, and in its march it is pointing out to us with ruthless clarity certain things it is our obligation and our duty to recognize and know about and act upon, numbed and bemused as we may be.
Mrs. Castles, it seems very hard to me, for any of us, to think really clearly, yet...
And yet never a time in our history, Mr. Child, when it is so critically essential that we do.
What sort of things do you refer to that you feel it is our obligation and duty to consider at this time?
The relentless rushing of our armies across Germany to meet the equally relentless onrush of the Russians makes evident that this phase of the global war is swiftly drawing to its close. At the same time, from all parts of the world, delegates are gathering on our shores to meet in San Francisco, to discuss with all the wisdom at their command the structure and machinery of an international organization for the preservation of world peace. It is to these things we must give thought, Mr. Child.
But, Mrs. Castles, we here, I mean we as individual people, can do nothing to hasten the fall of Germany. That remains in the hands of our fighting forces and their leaders. As far as the conference in San Francisco is concerned, I'm afraid, well, that there again, there's very little we individuals can do to make it spell success or failure.
I don't like to disagree with you, Mr. Child, but I do. In the first place, I don't believe any of us realize just how much people here at home have individually had to do with the speed of our fighting forces abroad. The individual pairs of hands that have worked night and day building the guns, the planes, the tanks, the ships, making supplies, the individual heart's blood that has made plasma, all these things and so much more. If they had not been done, and done in great quantities, our troops could not move as they are moving now. In the second place, what we have done to make possible the utter defeat of our enemy obligates us, as nothing else, to see to it that what has been so cruelly won must be worthwhile, and that such wars and sacrifices do not happen again.
I see what you mean. You feel we should do everything we can to support the building of an organization for world peace, and that because one war is drawing to its end, it's important that we think about this now and not wait until tomorrow. Is that it?
That's right. Not so very many years ago, Mr. Child, well within the memory of many of us, an effort was made to establish an international organization for peace, the League of Nations. That it failed has now become history. But there is one thing we should remember. People, individual people, were not too clear what it was all about, and consequently not too sure whether they believed in it or not. That is a mistake we cannot afford to repeat.
Well, I agree with you, yet it still seems hard to know just what an individual can do.
We're lucky these days in having many ways by which we can inform ourselves. Newspapers, more magazines than ever before in the time of the printed word, and most recent of all, the radio. By an intelligent use of all these, we can learn a great deal. We can read and hear both sides and come to our own conclusions. There is another way, too.
Another way?
Yes, discussion. Last week, Mr. Child, we listened in on a group of friends who were discussing the Dumbarton Oaks proposals. They became so interested in the subject, they decided to meet every week to study it further. Shall we listen to them again?
Yes, I'd like to very much. It might help us all.
Oh, hello, Margaret.
Hello,
You're early.
Alice.
How nice.
Well, Phil said he'd meet me here, so I thought I'd come over a little early to see if I could help you, Alice.
Oh, no, thanks. Everything's done, Margaret. I've just finished making some coffee.
Oh, good. It keeps me awake, but I love it. Phil says it's the only thing that does.
Does what?
Keeps me awake.
Oh, Margaret.
Oh, here come Janet and Duncan. I can see them from the window. I'll let them in, Alice.
Yes, do, please. Oh, hello, Olive. You're so nice and prompt, you two. George should be here any minute.
Oh, so should Philip.
We're a little ahead of time, I think, but Janet always gets off to a head start. Boy, that coffee smells good.
It certainly does, Alice. What a good idea.
I'll bring it in, folks.
Oh, here's Philip. Oh, hello.
Hi.
Come on in. We're all waiting. Where's George?
He couldn't come. Perhaps he'll be here later. Where's Alice?
Oh, she went to get the coffee, Phil. Take off your coat.
Margaret, did you bring over those notes of mine?
No, I didn't, Philip. Did you want me to?
Why, of course I did, honey. I had a lot of stuff I wanted to refer
Never
to.
mind, Phil. I left my notes at home, too. We'll just have to remember.
Well, here's your coffee, everyone. Now just go ahead and help yourselves.
Boy, that tastes good. Well, has anyone got any questions on their minds tonight?
I have. I want to know more about what you call a Security Council in the Dumbarton Oaks plan.
Why, Margaret?
Oh, I was just sort of wondering, Duncan.
Oh, I bet you read the same article I did, Margaret, about the 5 permanent nations on the Security Council.
I heard someone talking about that on the radio. Wasn't very clear to me.
Well, as I understand it, it's one of the main and most important parts of the whole plan. Isn't that so, Phil?
It's one of the most important, Duncan. But let's go back a bit first. You remember how the Dumbarton Oaks blueprint outlined the way that the World Organization should be set up?
You mean with the General Assembly and its Economic and Social Committee, the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, and the Military Staff Committee?
That's right.
Well, I finally got that much straight, but I'm still not sure what they all do.
I'm not exactly sure either, although Duncan drew me a beautiful chart.
Oh, it's really very simple. Phil drew me a chart, too. Well, it's like looking at the map of a cow in the cookbook. All the different cuts, I mean. Now, if you start at the tail...
Margaret, it has nothing to do with a cow.
Margaret's going to have to see it in her own way, Phil. Seriously, though, as I understand it, each member of the General Assembly is entitled to 1 vote. But how about the Security Council?
That's right, Duncan. Discussions are held in the General Assembly, and questions that can't be settled in this assembly are referred to the Security Council. We'll come to that later.
Well, how do they vote in the General Assembly?
Oh, how silly of you, Alice. Well, they vote like anyone else does. Well, like we did last fall, Phil and I.
Margaret. Alice means what percentage of votes
That's
count.
what I want to know, too.
Well, important decisions like recommendations for the maintenance of international peace and security and election of members to the Security Council and to the Economic and Social Council, admissions of members and so on. Suspension or expulsion of members and budgetary questions require a 2/3 majority of those present and voting.
Well, other questions, like determining the additional sort of questions to be decided by a 2/3 majority, are settled by a straight majority vote. Isn't that right?
Well, that seems easy enough. Do they do the same in the Security Council?
Well, not quite. It's a little bit different system there.
The problem's different. There's a distinction made between the quasi-judicial function of the Security Council in promoting peaceful settlements of disputes, and the political function of the Council in taking action for the maintenance of peace and security.
Well, I don't see why they have to make it harder. Do you, Janet?
Well, it is confusing, but, well, I suppose it's because the 2 councils serve a different purpose.
That's it, exactly. Where the Security Council is engaged in promoting peaceful settlements of disputes, no nation, large or small, should be above the law. This means that no nation, large or small, if it is a party to a dispute, would take part in the decisions of the Security Council.
They can take part on 9 specific counts. Isn't that it?
Yes. 1, whether the matter should be investigated. 2, whether the dispute is of the sort likely to threaten peace. 3, whether the council should call on the disputing parties to settle the dispute by means of their own choice.
4, whether a recommendation should be made as to methods and procedures of settlement. 5, whether the council, knowing of a dispute, should make recommendations before it is formally referred to the council.
Well, that one sounds ridiculous. I don't see why they can't wait.
Quiet, Margaret. Listen to the rest.
6, what this sort of recommendation would be if...
Oh, how can they possibly tell?
I do think it would be hard to make recommendations before a dispute was formally presented.
No, that's not so, Alice. The councils are bound to work closely together. If the Security Council sees trouble ahead, it should have the right to make recommendations to the General Assembly, if they are agreed that such a step is wise.
Yeah, I can see that. Look, go on with the rest of the list.
Well, that brings us down to number 7, whether the legal aspect of the dispute should be referred to the Court of Justice for advice. 8 is whether a regional agency should be asked to concern itself with the dispute. And finally, 9, whether the dispute should be referred to the General Assembly.
I thought the dispute came from the General Assembly, Philip.
Well, sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, Margaret, as we've just said.
That's one side of the Security Council. The other side, where the Council is called upon to perform its political functions of actions for keeping peace and security, a difference is made between the permanent members of the Council, the 5 great powers, and the other 6 rotating members.
Alice, I think I'd like another cup of coffee.
Well, that's a good idea, Margaret. Let's all have some.
Oh, you're not all getting sleepy, are you?
No, Phil, but my brain is beginning to feel like a dish of oatmeal.
Needs exercise, Janet. That's all. I guess all our thinking needs a bit of exercise. We haven't done too much of it in the past, I'm afraid.
That's true, Duncan. Makes me ashamed. Our kids know what they're fighting for. Bill knew before he was killed.
Yes, I know he knew from his letters.
They do know. We have a letter from Bob. I'll read you a part of it later. Yes, they know, all right. But they want to be sure that we know.
Well, I feel better now. I'm wide awake. What's the rest of the thing about the Security Council? You left off about there being a difference between the 5 permanent members and the other 6 when it comes to the need for political action for keeping peace and security.
Well, Margaret, I thought you weren't listening to a word.
Of course I was, Philip. I read Bob's letters, too, you know.
Good girl, Margaret. Well, anyway, the difference is made for the practical reasons that the permanent members of the council must, as a matter of necessity, bear the principal responsibility for action.
Oh, you mean unanimous agreement among the permanent members is a requisite, and that in such matters the concurrence of all the permanent members would be required.
Yeah, that's it. For instance, on questions like the determination of the existence of a real threat to or breach of peace, the use of force or other enforcement measures, approval of agreements for the supply of armed forces, and so
Well,
on.
it certainly is a lot clearer to me now, thanks to you all.
And it ought to work, I think.
If we give it all our support. If the people of the nations fail to support a world organization for peace, it can't work. It's people like us on...
That's just what Bob wrote. Listen, I'll read his letter for you. Here it is. We're all so keen, Dad, about Dumbarton Oaks and the San Francisco Conference. Here's our real chance. It can't be perfect, I know, but it's got to be tried. Dad, you and Mom and everyone at home have got to back it. If you could know what we've gone through because last time people didn't know or didn't care. Oh, Dad, it's got to be given every chance this time. Do everything you can, you and Mom.
Phil, I think it's time we went home. That second cup's beginning to wear off.
It's time we all went home. Well, thanks for everything, Alice.
Oh, it's been a wonderful evening for us and a helpful one, too.
Oh, we'll meet again next week. There's lots more to discuss.
Indeed, there is. Some of the problems.
Look, let's remember, it can't be perfect all at once. But the more we discuss it, the better we'll understand the problems and the need there'll be for patience.
Well, that's right, I think. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, and thanks for coming, all of you.
Patience. It's going to take a lot of that, Mrs. Castles.
It is indeed, Mr. Child. I should like to quote to you, however, some lines that should encourage us in the use of patience in these tense days. They are from the late President Roosevelt's message to Congress on January 6th of this year. He said, "It is not only a common danger which unites us, but a common hope. Ours is an association not of governments, but of peoples, and the people's hope is peace. It will not be easy to create this people's peace. The firm foundation can be built, and it will be built, but the continuance and assurance of a living peace must, in the long run, be the work of the people themselves."
And that's true.
So true, Mr. Child. The work of the people themselves. It is only with this and with their patience, their tolerance, their strength, and their courage given freely and forever that we can hope to move into that safe and shining world we pray for with all our weary hearts.
You just heard Mrs. John W. Castles, Jr. in the CDVO Consumer Program News and Letters from Home and Abroad. We have a lot of information available on these subjects. We're glad to send it to any of our radio audience or answer any inquiries you may have. CDVO has a list of services in need of volunteers, services in which you can do your part on the home front. Anyone wishing a copy of this list can write to this station, WNYC, Municipal Building, New York 7, or care of News and Letters from Home and Abroad program. Those participating in today's program were Emily Newman, Glen Lincoln, Rowena Clay, Leo Haas, Ted Field, and under the direction of Sarah Lutsky. Tune in at the same time next Friday for more letters and more news. This is the Municipal Broadcasting System.